first real Lutheran settlement in the Delaware Valley began in the year 1638, exactly 375 years ago, when two boats from Sweden arrived in what is today Wilmington, Delaware, on April the 8th, 1638. They had chosen this place deliberately. There were Dutch in New Amsterdam, now New York. There were English on the Chesapeake Bay. But in that middle area, no one had really claimed the territory. The commandant of the expedition was Peter Minuit, the former governor of New Netherland, who most people know about because of his purchase of Manhattan. He had become disillusioned with the Dutch West India Company and came to Sweden and volunteered to lead Sweden into a new colonial venture. There was a new France, there was a new England, there was a new Spain. Why should there not be a new Sweden? After all, Sweden was one of the superpowers of the 17th century because of the 30 Years' War. This small settlement was based on the model of the Dutch West India Company. That is, it was not to be a colony for people, it was to be a financial endeavor for exploitation. You would build a fort, you would make friends with the native people, and you would trade for furs and tobacco and send the money back to the initial investors. So it really began on the model of New Amsterdam and the Dutch West India Company. Unfortunately, after these two ships left and went back to Sweden, Peter Minuit dies in a tragic hurricane in the Caribbean, and they have to seek new leadership, but eventually they found it. After a temporary interim commander came a very famous person by the name of Johann Prince, former officer in the 30 Years' War, and a man who weighed over 400 pounds, who came with his wife and children for 3 years, ended up staying 10 years, and tried to increase the bounds of the colony of New Sweden. And by this time, it was clear that it would be more than exploitation, that they would really make it a royal colony. And the problem was, of course, that Sweden did not have excess population. It didn't have poverty. It didn't have people who were oppressed. It was very difficult to convince people to come to the New World, to New Sweden. Johann Prince tried his best, and there were altogether 13 voyages that came from Sweden to America. One ship in particular is well known, the Kalmar Nickel. It made the first voyage. It made 4 voyages. We now have a replica ship that's modeled on that original Kalmar Nickel that's moored in Wilmington, Delaware as Delaware's state ship, reminding us all of this first colony. The colony had a difficult time because of the fact that Sweden was involved in a number of wars in Europe. The 30 Years' War was not over. The Queen was only 6 years old when her father, Gustavus Adolphus, dies in war. So there's a regency that rules the country. They're involved in a war. They are uncertain about the border with Denmark. And in the midst of all of this, New Sweden falls through the cracks. There are very few visits from Sweden with trade goods, which was a problem. But the good thing was that the Swedes had a great relationship with the Indians. They were the only European group who did. The English and the Dutch murdered the American Indians without mercy. In New Sweden, the Swedes and the Indians, the Lenape, lived together in peace. It's a very interesting part of our history. In fact, the Lenape had a special word that dealt with the Swedes and Finns in New Sweden, and had a different word for the English, the Dutch, and the Germans. And part of this, of course, had to do with the fact that the colonists who came from Sweden and Finland were rural people who were used to living in the forest, just like the Lenape. So they had much in common. Whereas the Quaker businessmen who came and overrode Pennsylvania were trading people, and they were not really pleased to be walking in the forest and fishing in the streams. So the Lenape and the Swedes have a very special relationship, which exists even today. In the Swedish Colonial Society, there are Lenape members after all of these years, so that's interesting. Prince waited for 10 years and had almost no response from Sweden, and finally decided that he must go back to Sweden himself and tell people how important this colony was. But of course, he had to go back by way of New Amsterdam on a Dutch ship, which I'm sure he wasn't happy about, because the Dutch were very angry at the Swedish colony because it was cutting off their trade in furs, and they were losing their profits because of the Swedish colony. But Prince goes home, and the final governor comes, Johann Prince, and he has all sorts of great plans about how this would be a very successful colony, but he makes a major mistake. Coming up the Delaware River, Peter Stuyvesant had placed a fort at what is now called Newcastle. And when Governor Prince comes up in his pinnace and he sees that fort, the cannon fires, and there's no response from the fort. So they go in, and they find out that the Dutch fort has no gunpowder. Governor Prince says, well, then you'll just surrender, because you should have never been here anyway. This is New Sweden. It's nothing to do with New Netherland. This was the excuse that Stuyvesant needed to come and conquer the colony. So he comes about a year later, 1655, after 17 years, conquers the colony. Governor Prince and most of the officials go back to Sweden. But strangely enough, there were two ships coming across the Atlantic to be colonizers, mostly Finns. Why were they Finns? Well, these were Finns who lived in Sweden, who had a special slash and burn agricultural methodology that was getting them into problems in Sweden. And they had heard from their brothers and sisters here that the Lenape also did slash and burn agriculture, and they might come here and slash and burn to their heart's content. There was lots of space. So even though the colony is conquered by the Dutch, 2 more shiploads come. And we estimate after that there were about 300 people who were left in the colony of New Sweden. It went from Wilmington, Delaware, where it began, up into Pennsylvania. Right near the Philadelphia airport is where Governor Prince put his new capital and his new executive mansion. So he could be considered the first governor of Pennsylvania and the first judge. And in fact, in Harrisburg, Governor Prince is the first in the list in the governor's mansion of all the governors of Pennsylvania. Swedes settled up the Delaware, all as far as Trenton. They settled into New Jersey, Delaware, and a little bit into Maryland, into Elkton and to northeast Maryland. But the story really doesn't end there, because most of the people stayed. And the Dutch found it inconvenient to really conquer them in a harsh way. And Peter Stuyvesant believed that it would be better to attract them to the Dutch government than to oppose them. So he gave them self-rule. So that after 1655, the Swedes on the Delaware were called the Swedish Nation or the Upland Court. And the Swedes ruled themselves and had their own militia. Even though the official language from New Netherlands was Dutch, in the Delaware Valley, the language of trade and education and worship was Swedish. And there were 2 congregations which had been founded. One was founded at Governor Prince's new capital at Tinicum in Essington, what today is Essington, Pennsylvania. 1646, a church had been built there. Martin Luther's catechism had been translated into the Algonquin language, the first book in the Algonquin language, used for purposes of evangelization. And then as people moved, there was also a need for a church in Philadelphia. So in 1667, after the English took over, the Church of Tinicum was moved to South Philadelphia, which is today Gloria Dei Old Swedes Church, built in 1700. The original location in Wilmington, what was called Christina, that church dates from 1698. and you had these two Swedish congregations, but the last pastor died and there was no one to take over. So a famous letter was written to the king asking for pastors to come and promising to pay their salaries. The famous 1693 census of the Swedes on the Delaware. The king answered affirmatively. 3 pastors arrived in 1697, revived the work of the Church of Sweden on the Delaware, so that in addition to the 2 original churches in Wilmington and Philadelphia, which were built just at that time, at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, eventually there were 8 old Swedes churches, all of which still are in ministry today. 2 in New Jersey, in Swedesboro and Pennsville, 1 in Maryland, in Northeast Maryland, St. Mary Ann's Church, and then St. James in Kingsessing, Christ Upper Marion, St. Gabriel's, Douglasville, Amity Township. These congregations all ministered in Swedish, and they used Swedish up through the 1760s, 1770s. But of course, because of the predominance of English, especially the urban congregations, began to use the Book of Common Prayer. So therefore, eventually these congregations joined the Episcopal diocese in their particular states, because the German Lutherans prohibited anyone from joining who would not speak German. It was not a possibility. So we're grateful to the Episcopal Church for adopting these 8 congregations and keeping them going until today. So Swedish was used from 1638, when they first began the settlement, up through the 1760s, and during this time the church was primarily the bearer of the culture and the language, which was still in use. There are a number of interesting characters. Johann Prince was a fascinating person, but some of the other ones that are interesting is John Morton. You know, there's a town in Pennsylvania called Morton. It's named after that family. John Morton signed the Declaration of Independence. He was one of the representatives from Pennsylvania. He was a member of Gloria Dei Church, and he was the only Scandinavian to sign the Declaration of Independence. But the Swedish elements who lived here in the Delaware Valley, spread out along the waterways, had large families, and they began to move west. They began to move to the southwest, and over the years they spread out through the entire United States, so that we estimate today that there are about 20 million descendants of those original New Sweden settlers who came to America beginning in 1638. The altar that you see here is from Zion Lutheran Church in Worcester, Massachusetts. This is a congregation that was founded by Swedish immigrants at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And of course it represents the Augustana tradition here in the Northeast. The Swedish later immigration, 19th and early 20th century immigration, was rather different from the original one. The original immigration was primarily agricultural. The immigration which came later was urban. And this made also the Swedish immigration to New England and to New York very different from the Swedish immigration that came to the Midwest. People came to an area that was not just forming, but was already developed. But they brought things with them from Sweden, which did not always happen in the Midwest. For instance, you can see the enamels here of the 4 evangelists, and these were made by members of the congregation. They had immigrated from a town in Sweden called Höganäs, which is still one of the major centers of ceramics and pottery in Sweden. And since they had that ability, they used it to decorate the altar in their church. So we feel that this is a real treasure of immigrant art, and it's a beginning for our Augustana Museum here at the seminary. We have created an Augustana Institute and Museum. We're gathering things for the museum. This altar is one of them. This candlestick comes from Salem Lutheran Church in Brooklyn, which was the congregation in the East which used Swedish the most. They had regular Swedish congregation and services in Swedish through the 1970s. So that's a reminder from there. This plaque memorializes the founding of Uppsala College at Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Brooklyn in 1893. This, of course, was the only Swedish college in the East. It represented the Augustana Lutheran tradition, and we're very happy to have this as a memory of Uppsala College. It existed over 100 years. When it closed, the archives here in Philadelphia was invited to go to the library and to receive all of the materials that had to do with Swedish immigration or with the Lutheran Church. We have those archives here. They have never been processed. This is another project that we have still to do, about 80 boxes that need to be looked over and organized properly, but we're pleased that we saved the archives from the Library of Uppsala College, and the Seminary has been a good steward in helping us keep and preserve them for future generations. This is a chasuble from Gustavus Adolphus Lutheran Church in New York City that the congregation and its pastor, who graduated from the Lutheran Seminary at Philadelphia a few years ago, gave to the Augustana Museum. We're very pleased to have this. It's in need of some restoration, but we think it's perhaps the oldest chasuble in use in the Lutheran Church. The story of it coming to New York to Gustavus Adolphus is a fascinating one. Gustavus Adolphus was the first Swedish Lutheran church in the metropolitan area. It was founded in 1865, and by the beginning of the 20th century it had more than 2,000 members. It was a very active congregation, as it still is, and as the King of Sweden was coming to visit the Swedish Seminary in Rock Island, Illinois, he stopped by to visit Gustavus Adolphus. He had this chasuble with him, and when the pastor looked at it, he said, "That is such a beautiful chasuble. I wonder if I could wear it at the service tomorrow when you're here, so that we can show people the kind of vestments that are used in Sweden, because I would love to have something like this, and perhaps someone would volunteer to buy such a vestment for us." The king said, "Of course you may wear this tomorrow." So Maurice Stoppe came out of the sacristy and greeted the congregation and said, "I hope you like the chasuble that the King of Sweden has given to the congregation." And of course, the king then had to give it to the congregation and had to send a wire back to Sweden to get a chasuble to send to Augustana Seminary in Rock Island when he got there, so that he would have something to present to them. But it was used for many years, and until it got to be so old that it was in danger of coming apart. This is one of the interesting things, of course, is that the Swedish immigration to the northeast part of the United States that we are preserving here in the Augustana Institute and Museum was very close to the work of the Church of Sweden. This meant that there was a relationship between Philadelphia Seminary with its confessional and liturgical emphasis and the Swedish congregations who were founded in New England and New York. And one of the great examples of that is the mother congregation of Swedes in New England, First Lutheran in Brockton, Massachusetts, always one of the large congregations in the Northeast. When its first building was dedicated as Bethesda Lutheran Church, the speaker was Charles Porterfield Kraut, the great confessionalist, who of course was involved with the founding of Philadelphia Seminary in 1864. Already at that early stage, when Swedish was the language, they were happy to have someone come and speak in English if they were a confessional Lutheran. So that shows, I think, part of the connection. The other thing that's an important connection between Augustana and Philadelphia Seminary is Conrad Bergendorf, who is a legend, of course, as the president of Augustana College and Seminary in Rock Island, Illinois, who studied here. His father was a Swedish pastor here, and he, I think, absorbed much of the confessional, doctrinal, and social views that were current at the Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia in the 1920s. And when the merger came in 1962 between all of the groups to form the Lutheran Church in America, there was very little difference liturgically, doctrinally, or socially between the two churches. And part of that, I think, can be traced to Conrad Bergendorf, his charismatic personality, but also his interest in liturgics, ecumenism, and doctrine, which he had a strong connection with Philadelphia Seminary at that point. The chasuble was always the vestment used in Sweden from the first days of the conversion to Christianity over 1,000 years ago. Even when Holy Communion was not celebrated, the pastor wore a chasuble. It was the vestment that was used for worship. Interestingly enough, as years went by, the stole fell out of use and was not used in Sweden until the 20th century. But the chasuble was. It was always considered an important garment for worship. So I think that this particular chasuble not only shows the connection with Sweden, but it relates to that type of worship, which the Swedish High Mass was, one which was very similar to the work of the General Council here at Philadelphia Seminary, who advocated for the same type of use of Catholic items that were devotional for the people of God. I wanted to say something about Henry Melchior Muhlenberg and Carl Magnus Wrangel, because they had a very deep and enduring friendship. I think you could say, without a doubt, that Carl Magnus Wrangel and Muhlenberg were best friends. They were the best friend that either one ever had, and they served at a time in ministry when both had great difficulties. With Muhlenberg, the ministerium had not met for a number of years, and Carl Magnus Wrangel encouraged him to restart it. Wrangel also sat with him and wrote the Constitution for St. Michael's in Germantown. What was important about this Constitution is it became the basis for all the constitutions in the Ministerium of Pennsylvania, and then following that in the General Council, the United Lutheran Church, up until the present. So that first original document was a result of the cooperation between Carl Magnus Wrangel and Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. Wrangel was a fascinating person. He was dean of the Swedish Churches on the Delaware. He was in America from 1759 to 1768. He was a controversial character. He was a charismatic preacher. People lined up to hear him preach. When he preached in West Philadelphia, there wasn't room enough in the church for him. People would sit outside in the meadows to listen, and he established two more of Swedish churches in the Delaware Valley, one in southwest Philadelphia, St. James King Sessing, and one in Upper Marion at Christ Church in Bridgeport, Pennsylvania. His enthusiasm for ministry and his idea of doctrine and worship and pietism was very close to Muhlenberg. In fact, when Wrangel wanted to go home, Muhlenberg asked if he would not stay, and even suggested that the ministerium might consider having a bishop if Wrangel were to stay. Wrangel said no, he had to go home. He had a distinguished career when he went home, including being the chaplain to the King of Sweden, and many interesting things happening to him at the end of his life. But he and Muhlenberg exchanged letters their whole life and died within about 6 months of each other. But they really show the relationship between the Lutherans who formed the German ministerium and the Church of Sweden mission in the Delaware Valley. Carl Magnus Wrangel had received his doctorate from Tübingen, which was the same university that Muhlenberg had attended. In fact, they could speak together about various professors that they had. So they were very much on the same page. And Muhlenberg assisted Wrangel. Wrangel preached a lot for Muhlenberg because he was fluent in German, and there was a great need for pastors, and so they worked together very closely. But unfortunately, that close relationship did not translate to the congregations. The Swedish congregations, by the time that Wrangel had come, were becoming mostly English. People had been in the United States for a long time. They were mostly urban. The Germans were still recent immigrants, they were still rural, and they were more pietistic in many cases than the Swedish churches. So that the relationship between the congregations was never as strong as the relationship between the pastors. For instance, when the ministerium met in its conventions, the Swedish pastors were always invited and came. And since they could all speak German, they understood everything that was going on. But their congregations didn't understand German. So the German pastors, unless they could speak English, really were not supplying in Swedish churches. So there was a difference between where the pastors were and what they did and where the congregations were.